So hi and welcome. Welcome to the next series of the Videogram lectures. Today we welcome interdisciplinary artist, musician, and writer with a doctorate in medicine, Rouzbeh Shadpey, whose field of interest lies in exploring and demasking the whiteness of acousmatic listening and the colonial grammars of illness, with a focus on the aesthetic and poetics of diagnostic and fatigue. We see the act of listening primarily as an act of empathy and sensitivity towards others. However, this process reveals various forms of violence, oppressions, and militarization. Whether it is the shouts for help from drowning people migrating across the Mediterranean to Europe, the phrase "I can't breathe" that has exposed a series of police killings in the US, or the systematically ignored voice of indigenous and minority people. When a person of color screams for help and the white ears are the only ones listening, does that screams make a sound? With this phrase, which I borrowed from the Q&A from an artist talk that Rouzbeh gave earlier this year, I would like to leave the floor to today's guest. Rouzbeh, thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Jan. Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thanks for that introduction and for that neat summary about what we're going to talk about today. Just briefly, maybe to add to that introduction, as Jan mentioned, I'm an artist. I think about sound, I think about illness, I think about race and racialization and colonialism and how these things intertwine. I'm coming to you today from the unceded indigenous lands and waters of the Kalingahaga nations, Tjii'kaaga' Munyang, what we colonially call Montreal. And I remember when I was doing the research for what you're going to hear in this talk, which was last year in the spring, there were stories of a young woman called Joyce Shakian, an Atikamekw woman who passed away during her hospitalization at a hospital in Joliette, which is north of the Quebec province. And Joyce's story was the story of Naomi Musenga, that I was thinking about when I was making this work. And since then, there's been echoes of similar stories. And so that kind of, the reverberations of kind of settler violence, anti-Black violence and colonial violence and imperial violence are all quite, all function as a chorus, if you will. So I wanted to begin with that, perhaps. The talk today is a mix of research that I've done in the past and threads of new thinking of where I'm at now. And it mostly revolves around a work of mine called By These Straits to Die, which is a sound installation, which I exhibited in the spring of last year in Montreal at Centre Clark. But it takes it kind of and opens it more towards registers that I've been thinking with recently, which are psychoanalysis mainly. Yeah, so without further ado, I will start. It's mostly a structured lecture, so there'll be quite a bit of reading, but I encourage everybody to write their questions in the Q&A and hoping to have a nice discussion afterwards. So, the pathological ear witness. Before I decided to name this lecture The Pathological Ear Witness, as a nod to the writer Elias Kennedi's character study and book, I was going to call it The Case of Listening. I use the word case here in both its legal and medical registers, for my intention throughout this talk is to mount a case against a certain modality of listening, while demystifying its pathological components. The listening I'm referring to is a violent listening that belongs to the sensorium of whiteness, a listening both active and actively weaponized, through its continuous deployment against the sounds of Black, Indigenous, and racialized suffering, which it serves to disavow and distort. It is a listening that takes place often and everywhere, from the telephonic hold of the medical industrial complex to the acoustic reservoir of the Mediterranean basin. Most importantly, perhaps, it is a listening that, through its extractive mode of entering into non-relation, is not veritably a listening at all, but a psychoacoustic technology of policing operating under the feign of listening, hiding its violence in plain sight. The discourses at our disposal for theorizing the relations of sound to power often fall short in the face of listening, whose weaponization leaves no sonic footprint, rendering its diagnosis difficult and its effects pernicious. Instead of addressing this difficulty, we oftentimes laconically direct our attention toward the sounding body as a potential site of redemptive justice, continuously putting the onus on the speaker to express her suffering and bear the brunt of its burden. Theoretically, this manifests by way of an obsessive preoccupation with the voice, through the now well-worn liberal calls for its diversification, amplification, or rescuing from the void of silence. Albeit shrouded with good intentions, such theorizations fail to grapple with the basic principle of sound as medium, that is, sound as a relation. Through their myopic insistence on the liberating pretensions of sound in itself, a particular flavor of sonic materialism championed by the masturbatory vibrations of new materialists, object-oriented ontologists, posthumanists, and white ecofeminists, the role of the listener as the active agent of psychoacoustics gets ignored. What ensues is a free pass to violence which does not sound. That is, acts of violence that neither manifest a silence, a silencing, an alteration of legibility, or a fault in translation. This is violence that belongs to the realm of psychoacoustics, the violence of listening. How else, if not through a violent act of listening, are we to comprehend the case of the suffering racialized patient who, when telling their doctor that they are in pain, that they feel like they're about to die, is met not only with indifference, but suspicion or contempt? I want to suggest that this is the work of a listening engaged in a simultaneous hearing and not hearing, a listening that hollows the voice, its sound, from its sonic potential while keeping it within the realm of the sonorous, what we might consider an acousmatic hold. At the heart of these interrogations, blaringly absent, is the question of race and racializing violence within the discourses and practices of institutionalized sound studies and sound art. This I cannot stress enough. I was first made aware of this absence during my time as a student in an undergraduate faculty of sound studies. Although it is within this faculty that I honed a certain vocabulary concerning matters of sound, my disciplinary engagement with listening had begun years prior within the fields of medicine and psychiatry. Perhaps in light of this trajectory, listening to me has and continues to be intimately intertwined with the body, that is, the sick body. During my studies in medicine, I sat in classes on the explicit subject of empathetic listening. Classes meant to teach embryonic doctors the importance of listening in nurturing the patient-doctor relationship. Alongside abstract drivel on empathy, students were handed ready-made techniques that could automatically foster better listening. The nervous repetition of the expression, "I hear you," at predictable intervals being a personal favorite. Never discussed were the violent ramifications of failed listening, even as these regularly made news headlines. The cries for help of predominantly Black and Indigenous women succumbing time after time to the tin ears of the medical industrial complex. I hear you. They said, I hear you. And yet, I am no longer a doctor, but a patient who is an artist. For the past few years, I have suffered from a chronic undiagnosed illness that faithfully leadens me with fatigue. The thrust into patienthood, when suffering from a contested illness, or simply belonging to a racialized and gendered class of persons whose suffering is constantly disavowed by dominant structural and psychic forces, renders people acutely vulnerable to the listening of others. This includes doctors, but not only. In situations of illness, listening is disturbed, becoming the shared responsibility of caregivers, emergency call operators, family members, friends, social workers, triage nurses, neighbors, and so on. It is my belief that the listening that mats the walls of the clinic, where a white doctor dismisses the pain of a Black patient, cannot be thought of separately from the listening preached by sound studies and its practitioners. In other words, artistic and aesthetic registers of listening cannot be neatly sundered from their historical and material conditions and consequences. When this happens, we are left with the cognitive dissonance of the white sound artist, whose installation work, neatly nested in the equally skewed framework of Anthropocene art, beckons us to listen to more than human voices, while the overwhelming majority of voices continue to be dehumanized by the oppressive listening of the few. Although I will spend the majority of this lecture delivering what might resemble a critique, I would like to believe that my purview here is not solely that of the forensic scientist or the pathologist, whose arrival at the site of the crime is in the aftermath and thus always already too late. Beyond the corpse of institutional sound studies that lies in front of us, awaiting dissection, there is a plethora of places and practices where the work of listening continues to be reimagined. Lately, I have encountered these outside the disciplinary realm of sound proper, and within the fields of literature, visual arts, film, poetry, and psychoanalysis. It is in the spirit of hope that I wish to steer the final section of this talk toward those places where listening still feels possible. In psychoanalysis, this is considered the work of conversion, whence our symptoms are transformed. To write the case of listening is inevitably to write a case for listening, a listening to come that is already here, waiting to be heard. So I want to read this short character study by the writer Elias Kennedy, whose name is lends itself to this talk. It's called The Eartwitness, and it's from this book that's also entitled Eartwitness, and it's a collection of 50 archetypal character studies that are very funny and acute in their analysis. And I was drawn to the eponymous Eartwitness here. So I'm going to read it. It's not very long. It's a page and a half. The Eartwitness. The Eartwitness makes no effort to look, but he hears all the better. He comes, halts, huddles unnoticed in a corner, peers into a book or a display, hears whatever is to be heard, and moves away untouched and absent. One would think he was not there, for he is such an expert at vanishing. He's already somewhere else. He's already listening again. He knows all the places where there's something to be heard, stows it nicely away, and forgets nothing. He forgets nothing. One has to watch the Eartwitness when it is time for him to come out with everything. At such a time, he is another man. He is twice as large and 4 inches taller. How does he do it? Does he have a special high shoes for blurting things out? Could he possibly pad himself with pillows to make his words seem heavier and weightier? He does nothing else. He says it very precisely. Some people wish they had held their tongues. All those modern gadgets are superfluous. His ear is better and more faithful than any gadget. Nothing is erased, nothing is blocked, no matter how bad it is. Lies, curses, four-letter words, all kinds of indecencies, invectives from remote and little-known languages. He acutely registers even things he does not understand and delivers them unaltered if people wish him to do so. The earwitness cannot be corrupted by anybody. When it comes to this useful gift, which he alone has, he would take no heed of wife, child, or brother. Whatever he has heard, and even the good Lord is helpless to change it. But he also has human size, and just as others have their holidays on which they rest from work, he sometimes, albeit seldom, claps blinders on his ears and refrains from storing up the hearable things. This happens quite simply. He makes himself noticeable, he looks people in the eye. The things they say in these circumstances are quite unimportant and do not suffice to spell their doom. When he has taken off his secret ears, he is a friendly person. Everyone trusts him. Everyone likes to have a drink with him. Parlous phrases are exchanged. At such times, people have no inkling that they are speaking with the executioner himself. It is not to be believed how innocent people are when no one is eavesdropping. So I think this character of the earwitness that Canetti draws for us speaks to the pernicious power of listening, and also to the character of a listener that is almost spectral in its quality, that dips in and out and hears everything and collects everything there is to be heard, but retires himself untouched, unbothered. This kind of this notion of listening that I'm actively trying to work against, which is listening as this transparent canvas on which sound gets grafted. And that last line of the text is I think, it's quite chilling, because even in the humor that he's describing of how the earwitness is can put like flaps on his ears and close them and then become a normal person, an agreeable person, when somebody that then suddenly people are comfortable talking to, knowing that they won't be registered and recorded. Canetti kind of letting it slip that at such times, people have no inkling that they are speaking with the executioner himself. So this notion of the listener as an executioner, the power the listener holds. And this reminds me of Nietzsche's writing on ears and listening. And I can't remember where exactly, but I remember coming across these very funny descriptions by Nietzsche on his own ears, kind of how they're small ears, how they're almost like the organ themselves are cute, but how because of their size, he can discern certain things, whereas other large-eared people cannot. And Derrida has written about this in ways that are fruitful, and that could be fruitful for our thinking as well, but that I haven't gotten to yet. So that is for the earwitness. Now, moving along to By These Traits to Die. So By These Traits to Die is the name of the sound sensation that I made in the spring of this year, that I exhibited in the spring of this year, and that I started working on last year. And it has three components. There's a sonic piece that lasts 95 minutes and 4 seconds, and that loops continuously in the space. And in this installation shot, the piece is coming out of the parabolic speaker. You have a score that here is being deployed on a table as a map. And you have an element of it that I conceptualize as the underscore of the work. And the underscore for me is an open-ended element. It's the ongoing research element of the work. And it's open-ended, it's ongoing. This lecture is an instance of it, but as well as an essays that I published prior to this as well. And the reason it's called the underscore, it's because it's the thinking that undergirds the piece, if you will. So By These Traits to Die was born from the silence thread between two cases of racializing and anti-Black violence that inferred in the space of relation delimited by listening. The importance of theorizing this space as one created through the policing of white listening became important for me in understanding, redressing and resisting the violence that circulated through it. The two cases are, so the first case is the case of Naomi Musenga, who was a 22-year-old Black woman living in France in the Strasbourg region, a mother as well, who in December 29, 2017, called the SAMU, which are the emergency medical phone operators that dispatch medical help in France. She called the SAMU complaining of intense pain and saying that she felt like she was going to die. And the operator, who was a white woman at the time working, not only dismissed her claims, but met them mockingly, and effectively did not dispatch the help, did not dispatch an ambulance, and told Naomi to call SOS Médecins the next day. And because of this delay, Naomi was only able to reach the hospital 6 hours later, where she passed away of a mesenteric infarctus. Now, this case, the reason how this case became mediatized is because the sound of Naomi's conversation with the SAMU operator 3 months later got mediatized, got leaked essentially by a local media outlet called Hebdo in France. And the sound of the conversation essentially became viral and sparked a movement of justice for Naomi, and of justice against the operator, the SAMU operator, but also the entire structure of the SAMU in that region of France. Naomi's parents, a few months after that, brought a lawsuit against the SAMU operator for non-assistance pour personnes en péril, which is essentially which translates to the withholding of help to people in danger. So this was what the lawsuit was based on. From what I know, from what I could find, it's still in trial, so I don't know what the result of that is. So that's the first case, and I'm gonna talk about how these two cases speak to each other, and why I decided to put them in conversation with each other. The second case happened on the 3rd of October 2013, when a group of fishermen off the coast of the Italian island of Lampedusa withheld their assistance from a ship of over 366 drowning Eritrean and Somali so-called migrants that were making their way through Libya, crossing the Mediterranean to get to Lampedusa. And what struck me with this story was highly mediatized at the time, because at that moment, it was one of the most tragic instances of migrant death happening in the Mediterranean. Since then, there have been many other similar cases with just as many deaths, if not more. But what struck me was that in every piece that was run on what they called the Lampedusa tragedy, whether it's through the New Yorker and the Guardian or whatnot, there was always the opening. It always opened with an anecdote of the fishermen, the yachters that were kind of that were sailing their boats off the coast that day. It always opened with this anecdote of how they claimed that they heard the sound of a gaggle of seagulls, which they then realized to be the cries for help of the drowning people on the boat. And this stuck with me, this supposed minor detail, that the mistaken cries of help as the sound of a gaggle of seagulls. Okay, so before getting into the piece more profoundly, show you another image. This is the score that you saw on the table, and I'm going to play you 6 minutes and 8 seconds of the piece. And this consists of 2 hold cycles, and I'll explain to you what the hold cycles are after. But the piece is essentially a series of cycles. You have these cycles of 3 minutes and 4 seconds that cycle 30 times to make the full piece of 95 minutes and 4 seconds, which then eventually cycles again. So now you're going to hear two of the hold cycles.
Your call is very important to us. Please hold. Your call is very important to us. Please hold.
So I cut it a bit short because I saw the time, and there's still a few things I want to get through. But essentially, what you heard from the whole tone to the whole tone again is one cycle and is 3 minutes and 4 seconds. And that loops for 30 times, and then it loops again. So this is the sound that's heard in the piece. And it was at a volume that was quite low in the gallery, where it's almost inconspicuous. You're not too sure if you're hearing what, not only what you're hearing, but if you're hearing. And only when people made their way to the space and dipped their head under the speaker were they able to properly listen. But what does it mean to properly listen in this circumstance? So under a parabolic speaker lies a score spread like a map on a low table. Occupying the lower left corner of the score, where one might expect to find a compass or a cardinal system of directions, is a verse from a poem by the Jacobean metaphysical poet John Donne, titled Hymn to God, my God, in my sickness. It reads, "Since I am coming to that holy room, where with thy choir of saints forevermore, I shall be made thy music as I come. I tune the instrument here at the door, and what I must do then, think here before. Whilst my physicians by their love are grown, cosmographers and I their map who lie flat on this bed, that by them may be shown that this is my southwest discovery, per fretum febris, by these straits to die." So Donne wrote this poem believing that he was going to die, and in doing so, he intellectualized his death through the prism of cosmology, cartography, and developments in Renaissance science as means to sublimate his death. Donne survived. But this work is neither about Donne's life nor his death, because what I'm taking from Donne here is a broader question. What does it mean to hear his words rather than read them on a page? A poem is not conceived to be read, it is conceived to be heard. And to grasp what a poem has to offer, we must read it aloud. Only through sounding does the poem reveal its cardinal directions to us, leading us through its straits. The sonic dimension of By These Straits to Die is silent in the same way that a poem is silent without its activation. In other words, upon entering the work, your intuitive response is, of course, to listen to the piece and read the score. But you've been set up to fail. Because if you're trying to derive the meaning of the work solely from what you can listen to, you miss the point. What you hear in By These Straits to Die is a mundane soundscape of a brutal, negligent listening, one that exists within acoustic spaces of vulnerability, such as the telephonic please hold of the emergency health line or the Mediterranean basin. A listening here that is a psychoacoustic deployment of whiteness, which polices the sound of racialized suffering. So as I mentioned earlier, what you hear in the work is a listening whose sound has been drawn from the resonance between two cases. That of Naomi Musenga's death in France, who was mocked and refused life-saving assistance by a white medical SAMU operator, and the drowning of over 366 Eritrean and Somali so-called migrants off the coast of Lampedusa, whose cries for help were mistaken by local yachters as the sound of seagulls. Both these cases took place within a hold. That of the ship, that of the medical industrial complex, that of the phone line, that of listening. Both these cases represent legal instances of non-assistance pour personnes en péril, although only one of them is currently being tried as such in a court of law. Both these cases resulted in fatal anti-Black violence perpetrated by the wistful mishearings of white listeners. Both these cases are anchored in the Mediterranean, as Naomi's death prompted a widespread debate in France over the ongoing legacy of what is known as the syndrome méditerranéen, the Mediterranean syndrome, a racist pseudo-medical syndrome claiming that Black people feel less pain than whites. By sounding these resonances, the work attempts to trace a cosmological map of this violent listening and its constellations of illness, health, song, and whiteness. It does this by extracting the comfort noise from the audio of Naomi Musenga's conversation with the SAMU operator, layering it with fragments of Olivier Messiaen's L'Abîme des Oiseaux, fragments whose final note is abruptly interrupted by the please hold message and resumed in the form of a hold tone. These cycles of 3 minutes and 4 seconds, the length of Naomi Musenga's call, its leaked audio, orbit 30 times before beginning anew. So the noise you hear is called a comfort noise. And this is a name given to the noise used in radio and wireless communications to fill in the silence that results from the audio clarity of digital lines. Although such a baseline noise was an organic artifact of analog lines, it disappeared with the advent of digital communication. It was believed, however, that being on the receiving end of total silence could have unwanted effects on the listener, instilling in them the belief that the transmission had been lost, hence the artificial addition of the noise called comfort. In By These Straits to Die, the comfort noise became a sonic placeholder for white listening. In creating the audio piece, I used software to extrapolate the comfort noise of the audio recording of Naomi's call with the SAMU, and I amplified it by 14 decibels in order to create the baseline noise that lines the piece. In doing so, I wanted to make a commentary on the so-called forensic approach of some artists whose work, inadvertently or not, makes a spectacle of suffering through their reparative desire to display and educate artistic audiences on certain cases of violence. It was important for me to focus in this piece not on the sound of suffering, so as we said, the sound of the sufferer, the voice, but on that of the perpetrator here, which is the sound of listening. By forensically excising the comfort noise in the leaked audio and displaying it as evidence, I was hoping to demonstrate the futility of forensics, a search for evidence which always comes in too late in the aftermath of the crime. And the reason why, and this futility is twofold. It's the futility of forensics itself, but here I was amplifying it because, as I explained, the comfort noise is an artificially synthesized noise, unspecific to any one call. But its sonic dimension betrays a greater phenomenon of violent listening towards those that have been caught in its hold. So there was something futile in going in forensically, extracting this noise from this audio that was widely circulated, a violent audio, and grabbing the thing that itself is impotent as evidence, this noise, this comfort noise that is ubiquitous in all calls, is artificial. And this work of particulars abstraction, I wanted to push further, and I pursued it in using fragments of Olivier Messiaen's piece L'Abîme des Oiseaux to stand in for the bird song that the listeners of Lampedusa believed they heard. So this piece by Messiaen that's quite famous features a lead clarinetist mimicking the song of birds. And interestingly, I found out during my research that the original piece, the clarinet who played the original piece was called Henry Aoko, and he was a Jewish Algerian clarinetist who was captured with Messiaen during the war. They were both fighting on the Allied side, which adds another dimension to the song itself. But this is very rarely discussed, the role of Aoko, who later became a quite famous actor in France. So anyways, so again, this work of abstraction using Messiaen's piece to substitute the bird song. And bird song is an important aesthetic trope in the history and present of sound art. I mean, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen's piece Schubvogel, which translates as migration of birds, being just one example of this. Coming across the testimonies of the authors, how their listening effectively transmogrified the sounds of Black suffering into birdsong, I couldn't ignore the repeated incitements made by sound art to attune listeners to the sound of more than human voices. Could the result of all this ear training be that white listeners are more readily attuned to birdsong than that of the cries of help of people made migrants and refugees? Or perhaps this is a perpetration of an attunement that was always already there? Some questions I asked myself. As the author Yasmin Seal asks in a fantastic essay on the works of sound artist Lawrence Abu Hamdan, quote, how will we know the siren when it sounds? Okay, so I want to end this discussion on By These Straits to Die with the words of scholars P. Khalil Sosia and Tryon P. Woods, who remind us that there are no mistakes in the methodological workings of structural anti-Blackness, only, quote, the refusal to believe and to know, or more so, the desire to misrecognize Black suffering naturalized as so much wildlife, end quote. And indeed, what is hearing, if not the expression of a psychoacoustic desire under the gaze of acoustic experience? This is a link for a piece I wrote that's part of this conceptualization of the underscore that I'm talking about, that expresses some of the stuff I've just spoken about, but conceptualizes them more in the frame of the acousmatics, so listening devoid of sight. And Infrasonica is a great platform as well for critical sound writing. So that's something that I invite people to look at. I want to end. This is kind of the last section of the lecture, and it's an extension of the themes explored by These Straits to Die in kind of some of my current research and thinking. And so it's very much thinking that's still in process, working out in real time, if you will. But yeah, I thought it would be good to kind of to air some of this out together, and hopefully we can have discussions about this as well. So it's tentatively called Acoustic Apathy or Colonial Auditory Agnosia, a differential diagnosis of white listening. In The Force of Law, Jacques Derrida describes justice as an experience of the impossible. For Derrida, justice can only ever be a call for justice, an open-ended question never to be answered, only to be heeded. In the words of Jacqueline Rose, the psychoanalyst, who takes up Derrida's theory, quote, justice is always suspended along the path of its anticipation, whereas law may find itself accounted for, end quote. Whereas laws are frameworks congealed by the written word, amenable to contractual binding, justice, by contrast, is a call whose actualization depends on who, if anyone, awaits it listening. To grapple fully with the sonorous dimension of Derrida's call for justice might require us then to acknowledge the crucial role of the listener as its ethical addressee, the subject beckoned by and to its command. This is the same subject who, having tuned into justice's wavelength, becomes the addresser of justice, the voice resounding its call. We begin to notice here a blurring of the subject position that is characteristic of listening and can be distilled to the workings of language itself, where, with respect to listening, the active and passive voices become grammatically interchanged. For example, the active expression to listen equates to the passive expression to be told, whereas the passive expression to be heard equates to the active expression to tell. So this is what this kind of floppy diagram here is trying to show. In other words, the I who listens is always the you being addressed by a sound. If I raise the ambiguous subject position of listening here, it is not as a riddle to be solved, but out of concern with how this ambivalence of the listener as both addresser and addressee is often ignored and collapsed to one extremity, with the listener comfortably positioned as a passive subject. And yet, as Freud famously stated, it requires a great deal of activity to reach a passive aim. It is this activity which I seek to elucidate in the case for pathological earwitness. In her essay, Apathy and Accountability, the challenge of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission to the Intellectual of the Modern World, Jacqueline Rose undertakes a psychoanalytic inquiry of the phenomenon of apathy, beginning her reflection with the case of an unknown claimant who, on the grounds of apathy, sought amnesty at the Truth and Reconciliation Committee of South Africa. Quote, "Is apathy something communicable? Is it something we have a language for talking about? Or does it, more like a disease or shameful secret, rely on doing work invisibly in the dark? How can you fully disclose something whose chief property is deficiency, to be in some sense absent from history and missing to yourself?" The challenges faced by Rose in delimiting the contours of apathy, a phenomenon defined by its constitutive lack, find the resonance in our own attempt to delimit the borders of pathological listening. When listening is considered an a priori relation established by virtue of every and any sonic encounter, a voice simply to be filled with the stuff of sounding, it loses its potential for both reparation and harm. It becomes apathetic. Establishing the limits of accountability then becomes difficult. How does one hold another accountable for what they misheard as birdsong? How does one address the fragility of a white psyche whose incapacity to tune into the sound of Black suffering is the symptom of a glass ego petrified by the idea of resonance? Rose reminds us that the original meaning of the word apathy is to be without pathos, an insensitivity to suffering that has been considered a great virtue, that had been considered a great virtue for the Stoics having once practiced it. Harking back to this earlier definition, the apathy that grips our pathological earwitness might thus better be understood as the symptom of a listening whose desire, conscious or not, is to keep suffering at bay, or in our case, at sea. That this apathetic listening is not recognized as an act of violence in itself is further evidenced by the legal definition grafted upon both cases, that of, quote, non-assistance à personne en péril. It is the non-assistance and non-assistance à personne en péril that hints us that what is being condemned in both our cases is the withholding of action. Unsurprisingly, listening as an act already empty of will, void of agential muscularity, cannot be held on trial. In the eyes of the law, harm may only take place in its aftermath. So what I'm speaking about here, what I'm trying to kind of sit with the discomfort here is that the crime here, as is evidenced by the charge of withholding of help, happens in the aftermath of the act of listening. It happens in the withholding of help that follows an act of listening. And as so that the listening itself cannot be held accountable, cannot be held culpable, is not considered pathological or the site of a crime. And so the question here is, what makes listening so difficult to grasp? And thinking through Rose and her study of apathy and the ambivalence that is at the core of apathy, and tying this to the ambivalence of the act of listening itself, I'm thinking might be a way to better understand how one might grasp the work of listening as entity, something with agential weight and muscularity. And so, but the frameworks we have right now assumes that the ear witness properly hears the interlocutor and at second instance withholds their help. And so although this is implausible, such an analysis grossly reduces the complexity of the situation, binding us to individual, discrete variables, such as conscious intent or unconscious bias, impotent variables. So again, this kind of futile argument of, you know, is this an unconscious racial bias, or were they consciously deploying, or were they being consciously racist, which is a distinction of binaristic logic that does not serve us in any case, knowing the ambivalence of the phenomenon of listening. And so binaristic logic, such as this, ignores the myriad ways fantasy and consciousness draw on each other, interweaving the individual and political body out of the same psychic fabric. Faced with this futile overdetermination, we might turn towards concepts that refuse artificial distinctions between knowing and not knowing, hearing and not hearing. I'm reminded here of Anne Laura Stoller's concept of colonial aphasia. Stoller coined this concept in order to address what she perceived as being France's relation to its colonial history. That is one of simultaneous knowing and not knowing, as an alternative to the predominant analysis circulating at the time, whose diagnoses belonged to the realm of forgetting and colonial amnesia, collective amnesia. Stoller observed a dynamic closer to the neurological affliction of aphasia. So I quote, "Calling this phenomenon colonial aphasia is of course not an appeal to organic cognitive deficit among the French. Rather, it is to emphasize both loss of access and active dissociation. In aphasia, an occlusion of knowledge is the issue. It is not a matter of ignorance or absence. Aphasia is a dismembering, a difficulty speaking, a difficulty generating a vocabulary that associates appropriate words and concepts with appropriate things," and so on. Colonial aphasia, then, would neither consist of remembering or forgetting, but of a more difficult partial object of understanding, whose inherent characteristic is its fragmentary nature. In the spirit of Stoller, I want to propose that her pathological earwitness suffers from an auditory equivalence to colonial aphasia, an affliction we might be tempted to diagnose as colonial auditory agnosia, a deficit of listening shorn by the auditory system. This, of course, is a metaphor, but it also isn't. On May 27, 2021, a New York psychoanalyst by the name of Donald Moss published an article describing whiteness as a pathological entity in the Journal of the American Psychoanalytic Association. Titled "On Having Whiteness," its abstract began, "Whiteness is a condition one first acquires and then one has, a malignant, parasitic-like condition to which white people have a particular susceptibility." And the article ended with on a solemn prognosis, which is, "There is not yet a permanent cure." In the months that followed the article's publication, Moss was the recipient of vitriol and death threats, ushered by hordes of angry readers, notwithstanding some from his own esteemed colleagues. Moss's alleged crime here, and deontological misfiring, was not his proposal that whiteness and its privileges might distort one's lived experience, a project that is by no means novel. I mean, just think of Fanon and the work Fanon was doing in the 60s. But his explicit medicalization of the matter, expressing it in terms adjacent to the scientific and publishing it in a psychoanalytic journal. I liked Moss's piece. I thought it was good, but I was mostly fascinated by the breakdown in the collective white psyche that followed his intervention, how his piece unveiled the very stuff it sought to describe. And so in the spirit of Moss, I propose we add colonial auditory agnosia to the list of whiteness pathology. And there's a last section that thinks about Verlant and ambivalence, but I think I'm gonna end it here. So just to kind of sum it up here, this notion by Anne Laura Stoller of aphasia, which is a neurological condition that you see in neurodegenerative conditions, such as people who suffer from strokes. But it's a difficulty in language. And so it's not a forgetting either. It's an inaccessibility of language. So it's a simultaneous knowing and not knowing. And Stoller thought that this metaphor of colonial aphasia depicted France's own relationship to its colonial history, which was never one of knowing or not knowing, but something always ambivalent, always in between. And building from this, I think that like translating this in the auditory realm, we get colonial auditory agnosia, which would be its auditory equivalent. And this is a metaphor, but again, in kind of in the spirit of Moss, it also isn't. So what could we get by thinking about the violences of white listening in these terms of ambivalence and pathologization, not metaphorically, but seriously. And so, yeah, that was that. And I will say that there was a fourth part, which is the case for listening, which are examples of works, of sound works and listening works that I adore. And so it was kind of a more optimistic end to the critical talk. But even though we haven't had time to go over it, I'll gladly leave the PowerPoint and add the works to the list of readings or works to look at. But some beautiful works here that really give me hope in the field of sound and sound art. So anyway, thank you. Thanks for listening.
Oh, wow, thank you too. You opened like so many topics for discussion. Even here, I would like to open the floor for the Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, like feel free to ask directly or write them down to the chat. Yeah, there are just many things that I want to ask. Like when it comes to hearing or to listening, you know, like there are like ways. You know, you can, okay, like you have this objective image, like how you can describe, you know, you have like ways how to describe the sound. Okay, sound as acoustic pressure that is like moving through the space, etc., etc. And then like you have like, I don't know, inside of your hair, the organ of Corti, which hair cells are reacting to the sound, etc. But so we have this on one side, is like objective image of like what hearing or listening can be, but then is how we are understanding it. And it's like hearing is not an individual thing, even when it's occurring individually. Like when I hear something and you hear something, I share it with you, which is a complex interaction and this like grouping of ears. And which also like pointing to the thing that it's like there is like no universal listening, and you know, and the act of listening is actually, as you point, that is somehow determined by the social, like from where are you going, from where are you coming. And here I have in mind like a thing that like happened to me like several years ago. I was sitting at the time in my apartment with my friend. It was like late summer day, and my friend was at the time studying medicine. Like now he's neurologist, I think, already. And we were listening from the balcony to someone like very loudly screaming. And then we saw that there was like down the balcony, there was a lady that was like doing something in the garden, and she cut her hand and was bleeding. And while in a shock, was screaming for help, I immediately asked my friend at the time, the student of the medicine, that, hey, okay, it's like you have the tool, you have the set of mechanisms, go down and help her, or let's do it together. And he told me like really this like formula that he was teaching at the university, that, hey, it's not needed till she's screaming, she's still conscious.
Okay.
So
yeah.
She can like provide the care for herself.
Yeah.
And this is somehow like opening the question, like what is the relationship that we have with the voices, and like what is forming the relationship, what's set of mechanics and so on. I think it's just more a comment than a question.
Yeah. I mean, that's quite unnerving. What his comment on his take on things, that as long as there's voice, there's life, in a way, right? It's almost like which is this basic kind of this basic commentary, like, yes, indeed, if there's screaming, then she is conscious, but then I think for me, what that brings up is always this. It comes back to this question of evidence and forensics and the aftermath. It's this temporality of intervening in the always too late. It's kind of it's this intervention that seeks to cover the wounds, but never to address the source of injury itself. And yeah, no, I mean, that it's too bad that person is a doctor now.
But also, like, he was just like repeating what we basically learned during these studies, So it's like also just like moving forward some kind of like methodologies that are being set as the standard. Yeah. I will continue with a question from the chat. Hi, can you give us more examples of colonial auditory agnosia? Is a deeply interesting topic. And another one, also is a basic question, but what is a good way to build critical ear witnessing for ourselves?
Yeah, I mean, the colonial auditory agnosia, as I mentioned, it was just it's very much a concept that that is in process of being thought. So it's something that I kind of formalized for the first time this week as I was thinking about this lecture and the research I'd conducted and where I was at now. And it's not something really that that can encapsulate examples, but it's more this framework, as I said, of a simultaneous knowing and not knowing. So it would be kind of a conceptual phenomenon that engrosses a pathology, but a pathology of ambivalence that might allow us to think past these kind of stale arguments of, conscious awareness or unconscious bias. And as I mentioned, there was that piece by Donald Moss, the psychoanalyst, that caused this breakdown in the collective white psyche. It was truly fascinating. I mean, the piece itself is fine, but this piece called On Whiteness that essentially was published in a scientific journal by this psychoanalyst, and he wasn't a superstar psychoanalyst either. He was just like a practicing psychoanalyst in New York, I believe. But describing whiteness in this kind of medicalizing language and publishing it in a scientific journal, it just completely caused a meltdown of the collective psyche. And medicalization and pseudo-medicalization are weapons that have been used against racialized peoples under colonialism for centuries. And so it's interesting, this kind of this turning the lens, if you will, against whiteness this time around, and seeing what the reaction is there, seeing how that what kind of critical avenues it might open for us. So that would be my answer to that first question. A good way to build critical ear witnessing for ourselves. It's difficult. I think the work of witnessing and the work of testimony is something that is so shrouded in legality and frameworks of legality that it becomes difficult to salvage from a certain set of relations. And so I don't know if what I'd like to if I'm proning anything, is a critical ear witnessing. I think there's a difference between listening and ear witnessing. I think that's what I'm trying to say, is that the ear witness is, kind of going back to that, the piece by Kennedy that I read at the beginning of the talk. I think the ear witness is a dispossessive relationship to sound. Is listening as a dispossessive relation to sound. Is one that hoards and accumulates, and essentially dispossesses the speaker of their voice, if you will, or of their sound. So I don't know if what we need is a critical ear witnessing. I think there's a lot. I think listening happens all the time, everywhere, and it happens well. As I mentioned, this is kind of the part of the talk that I didn't get to, but the redeeming part of the talk. But my purview here was to discuss all the places that listening doesn't happen, where, but that it still takes place under the guise of listening, and the importance of situating the violence that happens within these spaces. Violence that often passes under the radar, if you will, because listening is constituted as such a passive act, as such a passive relation. So yeah, I think that's what I have to say.
Thank you. I would also like to ask you, like, on your opinion. I think that here I'm going to point to your text for the Infrasonica.
Yeah.
And, like, your opinion about basically the process of deep listening. I mean, the one established by Pauline Oliveros and her team.
Yeah, I mean, I love Pauline Oliveros. It's like she's brilliant. There's nothing to say about Oliveros's work here. It's not so much about deep listening as Pauline Oliveros conceptualized it and practiced it, but it's about how these discourses get taken up and are currently taken up by institutions of sound and by sound artist practitioners. So what I see a lot, and I mean, this might not be the case everywhere, but what I see a lot in sound art where I am is white sound artists that create, that theoretically anchor their work in these, in this Anthropocene framework, as kind of, situating their work as part of this legacy of Anthropocene art, and creating these installations that beg us or ask us to listen better, listen to different kinds of voices, whether these are more than human voices, non-human voices, etc. It's always this argument about recognizing a sound as a voice, which essentially comes back to this liberal claim of diversity, of diversification, of everyone having a voice, of every voice being heard. This, as if the problem was yet again, as if the problem was ignorance, as if the problem at the source of racializing violence was not hearing, or a voice not being loud enough, or not being diverse enough. So these interventions for me, they always situated at the level of, at a qualitative or quantitative level, at the level of sound. And the listening, whether it's a deep listening, whether it's the listening to more than human voices, etc., it has many names. It's an innocence. It's a presumption. It's an innocent. It's like it's a plastic, innocent listening that is considered transparent again, like as if the problem was just attention and focus, if you will. And what's missing here is any kind of awareness of critical race theory. I mean, like it's truly like it's bewildering for me, like how the institutions of sound are still completely in their kind of own bubble of this legacy of what they had in the 60s, still kind of perpetuating these tropes without any type of conversation about race. I mean, gender there's some, but race really, it's just nowhere to be found. So all that to say, I love Paulina Oliveros. Yeah.
Yes, again, questions to the audience, feel free to ask or to write down your questions. Yes, I'm kind of like also, it was also like one of the questions that I want to point to, or maybe more a comment than a question, in 2020, is actually a Canadian indigenous theorist, Dylan Robinson, published a book called Hungry. We probably know it, Hungry Listening, the indigenous sound studies. And for me, it was pretty strong, even when the book is itself, like it's really going more through the like music theory than the social studies. But still, the introduction of the book like starts with the quote by Raymond Ray Schaffer, which we all know. It's like one of the founders of like the Soundscape Project, Acoustic Ecology, etc. And yeah, I would like to read it out loud. Is a quote that is from his study on the limits of nationalism in Canadian music that was published in 1961, if I'm right. Eskimos are such an unmusical race that the composer really has to write his material to make it musically presentable. Yeah, I'm sorry, I have... I'm sorry, one more time. The Eskimos are such an unmusical race that the composer really has to wring his material to make it musically presentable. There is a marked similarity between an Eskimo singing and Sir Winston Churchill clearing his throat. And of course, it's from a study from the 1961, but still, I was like kind of shocked by even for that time this like very like colonial approach to music. But it's like not something that is only, you know, it's like not, yeah, like we are listening through like some container of the knowledge that reached during our lives, etc., etc. But it is also like pushed forward through the product of the process of listening. And for example, you are also as a musician, we are working with a musician, yeah, like your things are being released on a label such as Opal Tapes and so on. And it's also like how the software itself is being designed, you know, like let's say the most used like digital audio workstation for editing music or creating music, like in this case, like, Ableton. Yeah. That is very like built on, even when now they are trying to push it more to other perspective, but still it's like built on the Western tradition in music composition.
Yeah. I mean, that Dylan Robinson book is great. Hungry Listening. I think everybody should give it a read. It is quite anchored in a specificity that is the new music scene, and I think its set of questions are quite different than the ones I think about, but because as you mentioned, there's so many registers of of historical significance that come into play in listening. You know, like if we talk about music, then we get into a whole other realm of questions, right? And if we talk about speech, then we get into a whole other realm of questions as well. So it's difficult sometimes to talk about listening without going into these specificities. But it's funny that you mentioned that the Dylan Robinson book, because yes, that opening, that epigraph by Schaeffer is very jarring. And I mean, Schaeffer is still celebrated, like he's spoken about with so much love. Sorry, I think my internet, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes. Here is
okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. So Schaeffer is still spoken about with so much love, but then those words are so jarring and disgusting that, again, it's hard not to trace the line between this kind of the legacy of you know, ecological thinking and ecofascism and colonialism kind of into the present here. But I was thinking with that book, actually, and this is something that I was thinking about including in the talk, but Dylan Robinson, at some point in the book, he has this conversation on this expression tin ear, having a tin ear. I don't know if that's something that you remember, if you came across, but he's talking about this land claim trial, essentially, where the Wet'suwet'en Nation sought jurisdiction over their territories in northern British Columbia, I believe. And this was, I hope I'm not mistaken here. I have to go back and double check, but he's speaking about a land trial where one of the registers of evidence brought by the indigenous claimants was the song, and then this caused a kind of a scandal, if you will, because then the judge came out and said that he has a tin ear. Like, he can't hear a song because he had a tin ear. So he didn't want to allow, first of all, he didn't want to allow the song in the court. And then second, he didn't want to recognize it as any type of evidence. And this expression he used is that of the tin ear. And it was interesting to me because I had recently rewatched Lawrence Abu Hamdan's video for his installation Rubber Coated Steel, which is also about a trial and listening and the sound that rubber bullets make versus the sound of actual bullets. And one of the slides in the video is this caption of a judge saying that, "I must admit I have somewhat of a tin ear when it comes to these things." So I was, it's something that I think merits more reflection about this expression, the kind of the materiality of the tin ear, this, and why judges keep on saying it kind of across time and history. Like, what is it with judges in tin ears? But anyway, that was kind of a bit of a detour. But to get back to the music thing, and maybe to answer this question in the chat, I don't know. I mean, my Golpesar, my musical project is, I don't see it as decolonizing anything. I mean, I don't know if I think there are, like you said, and Khiyam Alami like makes great work about this, about how our softwares allow us only to create a certain type of sound and music, whether it's Ableton or Pro Tools or anything. And then, you know, he has his, I forget what his software is called, Apostrophe or something, but that works with like microtones and, you know, tries to get away of this like classical equal temperament, Western tuning. On my own end, I don't know if it decolonizes anything. I don't think it does. It's just, what I know is that I was kind of trained in, you know, in like electroacoustics and electroacoustic composition, and yes, that has a legacy that's very white and very manly. But the thing that I found liberating from kind of electroacoustic composition was the complete disregard for rhythm and pitch in a certain way. And I think that that's still something that is underappreciated. And I like, yes, for sure, creating that kind of music in Ableton is a pain in the ass, because like there's the grid. Essentially, it's the grid. You know, it's always, everything kind of fights against the grid, and you know, you can't have like different tracks going at different tempos, for example. You know, like something so basic as having like different tempos for each track. It's like something you can't be done. There's always the master tempo that like so there are frustrations there. But I think for me, like if there's anything I try to do with Goldpesad is working against these kind of like grid abstractions of pitch and rhythm, while still trying to make music that's, you know, like fun, if you will, like, yeah.
Thank you. I think they're like quite the hard questions that I addressed you, so sorry for that.
No.
If I made you uncomfortable at some point.
No.
For me, it's also like this will be kind of off topic, but you made this like shift from hard science, which is the medicine, to art, or like to processes that are describing the world by interpretation.
Yeah.
You explain the health condition and so on, but what out of this, like what is the main shift for you to like to switch from discipline that it's somehow like very rooted in methods and in the way how to build the knowledge, into a discipline that is like more open to experiment, to fail, etc.
Yeah. I mean, that's another hard question. But yeah, I mean, I had many reasons for the shift, and I don't know if when I did it, if it had anything to do with the kind of the nature of the science of medicine, or medicine as a science, and kind of the freedom of art, if you will. But for me at the time, it was rooted in, because I was a psychiatry resident, and if anything, it had more to do with my politics, and the shifting of my politics, and the kind of becoming confronted with the reality that is psychiatric practice, if you will. You know, you're taught one thing, but then when you start working and you're kind of a pawn in the institution, and at that time I was also my own politics were radicalizing, and you know, becoming aware of kind of the institution of psychiatry as a carceral institution. You know, these things that are never taught in med school. Like, you don't read Foucault in med school. Like, you know what I mean? Like, so it was that kind of process of maturation that confronted me with the impossibility of staying within and of affecting a change within. Now, I think what you're describing is still very much relevant and true, because more and more I find myself revisiting questions that are medical questions, essentially, but with a framework that's not just medical, but completely anti-disciplinary, in the sense that, you know, like I think you get a notion through my work that the discourses that are being brought in to think of these questions don't respect any disciplinary conventions of knowledge. Like everyone and everything is welcome to the party here, you know, to think about what is being thought. And I think this is the only way to address the complexity of these questions. And the way I found the most satisfying. So art, yeah, I mean, art is great for this, but then there's frictions also within art, you know, within the institution and kind of displaying work like this in contexts that don't demand, you know, time and respect and like active engagement, you know. So it's also, it's you know, it's not all great either. Like you kind of, it's continuously negotiating with the institution, really. Yeah.
And are there now like any things that you are like working currently on when it comes to your art practice or art research?
Yeah, I mean, I'm finishing up a film, kind of a short film, and it's my first video work, which I'm quite happy about. And it thinks about forgetting and the memory test, which is like a test used in medicine to evaluate dementia. So it's this kind of video essay that takes these questions, but that subverts them speculatively to create a kind of a tale that hopefully restores some dignity to the act of forgetting. And lately I've also been thinking and working on the theme of fatigue as well. Fatigue, which is such a neutral, ambiguous phenomena, something that kind of philosophers and doctors and theorists all have spoken about, but nobody really knows what it is. So it seems to me the ideal kind of playground to raise some difficult questions. So yeah, lately that's been my work.
Okay, so I can see that we have no other questions, and we also somehow fulfilled our time. So
yeah,
I will really like to thank you. Thank you for your time, for your talk and all the answers.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you for the great questions and the chat and the invitation. Yeah.
Yes, so as I'm last like just trying to like use as the way to say goodbye. Hope to see you next time on the dance floor.
Yeah, hopefully. Yeah. Yeah, I'd like that. All right.
Okay. So thank you and ciao.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.